So a couple of housekeeping items. You want to make sure that you get your parking validated downstairs at the front desk. Get your parking validated before you leave today. Inside your bags, inside the bags were Radio Club of America membership forms. If you've ever wanted to become a member, now's a great time. You can give a completed form to me or Terry, or you can mail it in. Or I see Vice President Barney Scholl is in the background there. He will also take your membership forms. There is a Radio Club of America breakfast upstairs on Sunday morning at the rooftop restaurant here at the Crowne Plaza. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the Radio Club of America, that's a good time to have breakfast. The breakfast starts at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. And if you'd like to learn more and become a member, that's a great time to do it. If you wanted to take additional T-shirts home, Terry is selling T-shirts out in the foyer. And also we have some spare books that you can buy. And she might even have some additional CTU totes that you can have. So see Terry. At 5 o'clock, she's going to be wrapped up and out of here. She does have a commitment pretty quick after Contest University, so you want to make sure if you want additional T-shirts, CTU textbooks, or the CTU bags, you get out there before 5 o'clock because she will be shutting down for the afternoon. So it's just about 4 o'clock. Let's get started with our final presentation. We've been doing this every year here at CTU, and our next presenter puts a whole lot of work into these presentations. In fact, he was making lab measurements just until a few days ago. Please give a warm CTU welcome to Rob Sherwood, NC0B.
Thank you, Tim, and I certainly enjoy the invitation. This is the 12th year in a row, so one got away. So as each year I talk about what came out in the last year and got to use it on the air, and then of course a bunch of technical stuff. And then hybrid architecture, something was new that was shown last year at Dayton, and I explained that. We've got lots of good receivers these days in our transceivers, but the transmitters are lagging, so that's something we can look forward to press the OEMs to give us some improvements there. So what's important in a contest? Well, we want to receive the weak signals. We got strong signals everywhere. De-expedition, pile up, whatever the case may be. And on CW, on a de-expedition, everybody's up 2, of course. We're split, thank goodness. And on sideband, maybe up 5 or 10. And you're going to need a better receiver for CW, and I'll explain why that is. And what's the weak link today? As I just mentioned, it's the transmitters. So what's the state of the art today? Not something like one ethereal rig, but we've got 100 dB dynamic range radios, or very close to that. Reciprocal mixing dynamic range, that may not be a term you're real familiar with. The league defined it a few years ago, but it has to do with phase noise, the cleanliness of the synthesizer, or the new direct sampling rigs, the clock. So that suddenly has become not a problem anymore, where if you go back in time, it really was. So we've got an amazing number of rigs that meet those criteria of, like, let's say 96 dB dynamic range or better, and not reciprocal mixing limited. In other words, the phase noise is not the limit. And look at all 5 major brands there. So we've got lots of choices and amazing radios out there, and none of them are limited by either the local oscillator or the synthesizer. Well, last year we saw 2 new radios announced at Dayton, the TS890S, and that's a hybrid architecture, which I'll explain that. And that happened to be the best RMDR measurement I'd ever made, and then I found out, was maybe February, it showed up in an ad. So it said, Rob Sherwood, blah, blah, blah. That was a surprise, but it's a true statement. Now, the 890 is just a single receiver. It does not have dual receivers like the 7610, for instance. But, of course, you can punch a button and listen on the other frequency of the VFO. Now that shipped in time for CQ Worldwide, and so I started using it then. Those are the main contests I run from October through January or maybe March. And then the FTDX 101D, of course, everyone was sort of excited to see that. It was kind of under a plastic bubble. I don't know if it was even a functioning unit. It may have been just playing a video. I don't know. But anyway, it shipped. But it only shipped like the end of end of April. I only saw it 1 week ago. It showed up in my house thanks to a very helpful ham who said, I'm going to loan you my rig. So that was really great. It does have dual receivers. And so I was in the lab, as Tim mentioned, last Thursday and Friday. And then I spent all weekend updating this presentation because guess what? All sorts of pages changed, like about, I think I made about 25 updates. So let's look at the 890S that's now been out for a while. The previous model, the 990S, which I actually owned until an unfortunate lightning strike, and I guess I didn't follow all the rules. If any of you that found out how to minimize lightning damage, well, anyway, my 990 bit the dust about 3 years ago. Most of the time, the 990 was just fine. Certainly in my location out in the middle of nowhere in Colorado, it was never an issue. But if you're in a high RF environment, I mean, like field day is the worst case probably, you got a ham a mile away. So it's really nice to have a clean local oscillator. And so the difference between the 990 and the 890 was they really solved the problem. They just went to the stratosphere on that. I actually had to buy some new test equipment. Well, just little oscillators that I got on eBay. The Wenzel oscillators, very low noise, because you don't want to be measuring your test equipment. You want to measure the radio, the device under test. So I had to do that in order to get really accurate measurements, but my other equipment was fine. So here's the comparison between the 990 and the 890. You'll see actually the 990 was a little bit higher on 20 kc dynamic range. And but the big difference was close in, it was really the synthesizer. So look at the bottom one there, the 2 kc reciprocal mixing dynamic range went from 89 for the older radio to the current one, 127. Of course, both are still available, but that difference, 89 to 127, is kind of pretty obvious. So what contest did I run this past season, starting with CQ Worldwide? Well, since the Kenwood was the new kid on the block, that got allocated. Well, I have 3 operating positions, so I can compare radios easily. I just changed chairs. So it was set up for 15 or 20. 20 was the money band, but 15 wasn't far behind. I was really happy out in Colorado that 15 did as well as it did. And then I relegated the 7610, which I'd used extensively last year, the previous season, to 40 and 80. And I run the 2 main ARRL contests in December. I consider those real important. And the W1BB, I don't know if you operate top band, but that's a contest at the end of December. If you wonder why I only ran 1 rig in CQ Worldwide contest, I had a problem with an amplifier, and I basically just operated the contest to have fun instead of comparing radios. So how did the rigs stack up? Well, I mean, obviously CQ Worldwide sideband is extremely important and very well attended contest, but really most of the time when we're on the sideband, it's really adjacent channel splatter. That's the limitation. And isn't like we're saying, well, the guy's running his knobs to 11 like you saw this morning, or is he driving his amp that takes 50 watts of drive and driving it at 100 watts? It's just the way rigs are today, that the amount of distortion products that cause splatter, on the opposite sideband in effect or a few kcs away could be better. So we really need to look at the CW contest and see how they really compare in it, where the radio might be the limit. So the ARRL 160, high density signals, the 10 meter, well, weight 10 meters are these days, spend a lot of time on CW, weak signals. So how do we compare between say the 7610 and the TS890S on selectivity? It's all DSP, of course, today, or the audio peak filter, which really is a lifesaver. It reduces the noise and the fatigue. They're very similar, and I had no reason to pick one over the other from that standpoint. Since I'm running S&P And I'm running about 26 or 28 words a minute, semi-break-in, and they both work very well. I would say from the standpoint of comparison, the noise reduction and the noise blanking on the Icom comes out ahead. But then on the other standpoint, the waterfall on this TS890S, I was just so enthralled with it that I said, I've got to own this radio. Now, I'm an S&P operator, so I explained how it worked, but that was something totally different, although N1M pointed out that his program can do some of this, so I hadn't done that yet. So when we're running, you probably, maybe not that important for the spectrum scope and the waterfall, but if you're multiplier station or you're running a S&P like I do, you really need the spectrum scope and the waterfall. I wouldn't buy a radio today without a really good spectrum scope and waterfall. So let's look at how these two different kinds of radios work. Now this is an Icom 7610, which I've been running now for 2 years. And this is a slightly exaggerated example of what happens when you tune it from one station to the next. I call it its smears. This is the waterfall at the bottom. There isn't much right now on the spectrum scope because that wasn't during the contest. But when you tune it, it makes a big horizontal or diagonal line. And also because normally if I was trying to reduce noise, I'll have averaging turned on. But then if you've got that turned on and you tune it, well, the signal goes away if it's weak and for a couple of seconds until it catches up with the averaging. So that was a limitation for that, and what I did was turn the averaging off, and I just used the band scope as opposed to the waterfall with the 7610. Now here is the Kenwood, and it's totally different in that when you tune it, it just shifts the waterfall, the whole thing at one time. Now when you tune it, of course, it has a little dead spot. Overlook there on the left is a blank area, and that fills in over the next 30 seconds. But since this is just a 5 kc bandwidth, and so the signals are so close together that I don't care if I'm missing the left-hand edge or the right-hand edge, because I'm just picking the signals off one at a time. They're more towards the center. So there was no smearing. I could run full averaging, and just the other thing that's kind of amazing, what Kenwood did, when you start tuning, the waterfall brightens up for the amount of bandwidth you've selected with your DSP. So if you had it at 500 hertz or 300 hertz or whatever, that's right in the middle, and it's brighter, so you just tune the next signal that's on the waterfall, boom, center tune it, copy the call, work him, go on to the next one. So that's pretty clever. This will give you an idea of density of signals, and was happy to, this is a 10 kc bandwidth and not a 5 kc, but this was on 10 meters on Saturday afternoon. And you can, of course, in the waterfall, you'll see signals over the last 30 seconds. And that's the kind of density that we had with the sunspots, pretty minimal. So it was a fun contest. I didn't spend a great amount of time on sideband, certainly did some, but it was really working a lot of weak signals and picking up just fine. Was running the preamp, of course, on 10 meters, and that makes the display even more sensitive. There's the 160 contest. Well, there's 30 stations in 10 kilohertz. And of course, since it's the snapshot, there'll be the signals on the band scope. There aren't going to be as many as you see on the waterfall, but it's pretty darn busy. Being the S&P operator, I'll start at 1800 and go clear up to 1860, 70, 80, depending on what time of day it is in the evening, of course. And it can take me 2 hours sometimes to work all the way through. And so it was really, really enjoyable to do that. If you can see there on the left, it says ATT, attenuator. It's set on 12 dB. And I'm going to explain later why I did that. Now, that's kind of critical, particularly with the direct sampling radios. So very important issue to be talking about how are we running our radio. So this was the year, last date into this year, of the legacy hybrid, I'll call it. The radio's architecture is like an Orion or a K3. It's a down conversion radio. And down conversion, of course, means if you go back in time for maybe 20 years, all the pre-selectors went away, like a Drake or a Collins, and everything was called up conversion. The first IF was certainly above 10 meters, and usually above 6 meters. And the roofing filter was very wide, 15 kilohertz or 20. And that's what we had. Everybody did that for 20 years. And so then suddenly the Orion came out, and then of course the K3 came out in 2008, and the performance shot way up. So that changed everything. So we had what I'll call the legacy radio that still exists today, of course. And then the direct samplings came out, I think 2014 when the Flex came out. And so those where we had Flex and Apache and the Icom, the new Icom radios, they're direct sampling. The term roofing filter doesn't apply at all. And now we've got both. We've got the radios that, like the new Kenwood or the new Yaesu that just came out, where we're doing the older down conversion type, but the band scopes are fantastic, just like in the direct sampling radios, like the Flex or the Apache or the newer Icoms. So that's the hybrid, in that the direct sampling only applies to the display. And so what they do is, after the first mixer, but before the narrow roofing filter, that's where they pick off and do the direct sampling. So it's not trying to look at 160 and 6 meters, it's just looking at 9 megahertz or whatever the IF is. Now, from a gain standpoint, we have to be really careful when we're looking at the direct sampling radios, because they don't have a roofing filter, but they have an LC input. You know, we've got to have a bandpass filter. We're tuned to 40 meters. It's going to cover 300 kilohertz. So the radio in that case of direct sampling radio is looking at the whole band. So you might consider the roofing filter hundreds of kilohertz wide, or 10 meters, almost 2 megahertz wide. So that's a real difference. If we're in field day, if we got a ham a mile or two away, we're at a multi contest, or maybe you're the malt station, that's where we've got to be really careful how we run the direct sampling radios, because unlike with the K3, just as an example, it has a very high blocking number, and so does the Kenwood. Well, the roofing filter eliminates about 95% of the signals, or 98% of the signals on the band. They go through the preamp if it's on, they go through the first mixer, and then they got the roofing filter. So everything downstream doesn't have to see much, either a few kilohertz or a few hundred hertz. But with the direct sampling, we see the whole band. Now, maybe we've got a tracking pre-selector like the 7610 or the 7851 or the 990, but as an example, but that's not real sharp. Now, if you're working, say, like East Coast, and you're on 40 meters at the low end of the CW band, and the broadcast stations are all above 7200, the tracking pre-selector will be helpful, and even be more helpful on 160 from a fractional bandwidth standpoint. But if we're on 20 meters, or let alone 10 meters, that tracking pre-selector isn't going to do too much. So we really have to watch total gain, and we also need to realize, when do we need a preamp? Now, if we're talking about listening on our transmit antenna, we're not talking about a beverage or something like that, some sort of a low gain receiving antenna. On 20 meters, I can't imagine you're going to need your preamp very often. Certainly at night on the low bands, there's no reason ever to be running your preamp. You really should be running some attenuation. So we have to really watch our total gain with the new direct sampling style. But we can be kind of careless with the like a K3 type of radio, because it's not going to see except whatever's coming in the roofing filter. So, as I mentioned when I said, look at the 12 dB attenuation on that 160 meter example. If band noise is reading up scale on your S meter, and it's going to vary with bandwidth. If you're in sideband, it's going to read higher than if you're on CW. If band noise is reading up scale, that's no advantage. And we really don't want it to, for two reasons. When we'd like to optimize the reception of the receiver so we couldn't overload it. But you know, when you're in a contest for 20 hours, 40 hours, however many hours you can manage to stay awake, noise is really tiring. I call it contest fatigue. And if we can adjust the AGC threshold by adjusting the attenuator or the RF gain, we really would like the threshold of the AGC to be above band noise, like 6 dB, maybe up to 10. Now that'll mean every once in a while you'd be working a really weak station, maybe you'd have to turn the AF gain up a bit. But most of the time, the fact that when you're tuning between stations or there's just a pause in transmission, that band noise isn't as loud as all the other signals. And it's just so tiring to do that. So if you can get used to adjusting your attenuation and or your RF gain so that the band noise is not running the AGC, I think you're going to be a lot happier and less tired. And that applies to any radio. I don't care what type it is, but there in this case of the direct sampling, well, if we're in Germany on 40 meters and you got a broadcast station at 7205 and you're on 7193 or something, we would really like to reduce the possibility that strong station is going to give us a problem. So at night on the 40 meters and 80 meters, I'll typically be running 12 dB attenuation, certainly 6, but probably 12. And on 160 at night, in that example, I was running 12, but sometimes in the heat of battle and when the signals are really strong, I may bump it up to 18. And you say, well, how am I going to hear stations if I got that much attenuation? But remember, receivers are now so sensitive, they've got to work on 6 meters, let alone 10. They're about 30 dB more sensitive than band noise is on 80 and 160 and 40. So if we're putting in 12 dB attenuation, we've still got sensitivity to burn. So you're absolutely lose nothing. When a year or two ago now, when I was comparing the 7300 to the 7610, yes, that's correct. I was running the 7300 only has a 20 dB attenuator, and I was comparing it to the TS890, that's right. Well, so I set one at 20, which is my only choice on the little Icom, and I set the TS890 to 18 dB. That was a little more than I'd run the previous year, which was 12, and I found this really was even less tiring because band noise was just almost out of the picture. And then you add a little bit of noise reduction and the audio peak filter, and I would say it was the most pleasant operating I'd ever done in 160 from the standpoint of getting tired from noise. So what do we really want today? Well, we want QSK or click-free semi-break-in, and I do run semi-break-in, but I want to be able to hear between like my call and what report I'm giving out, which is 599, but whatever. The audio peak filter, for me, reduced fatigue. I don't set it real sharp. It seems like the K3 is a little too narrow for me, for an example, so I'd have it about the same bandwidth as a DSP. The band scope and waterfall are, I would consider them a mandatory today. And we need a good user interface. I don't want to be having to go find some menu adjustment in the middle of the contest. And a lot of the radios that are running by computer only, the direct samplers like the Flex or the Apache, for instance, a lot of people use some other knobs. I mean, or with the Flex, you can get the Maestro. The DJ console is popular, that you've got more knobs than just tuning, so that you don't have to be finding your mouse and go find something to adjust. So let's look at some numbers and see what those mean. If you look at my website, they're full of numbers, and you're like, okay, what? And I think when I purchased the 890, that's the first time I'd owned a radio that was over 100 dB. I've been running radios that were less, and I felt no problem. So don't get so fixated, say, well, I've got to have this, the highest number. We've got quite a range of radios that do really well. And so if you've got a radio that's listed on my website, 85 dB, or in the ARRL product reviews, and just run it properly, you're going to do fine. So what does dynamic range mean? It was defined clear back in 1975 in QST and Ham Radio Magazine, but they said at that point, all we had was really sensitivity and maybe another term or two, selectivity, of course, but they said put in 2 signals, and then we were going to increase the 2 signals until the distortion in the radio equals the noise floor of the receiver. We're just going to define that as dynamic range. So if, for an example, if the noise floor was minus 128 dBm with the preamp off, and if we had to feed in two signals that were minus 28, just as an example, well, the difference between those two numbers is 100 dB. So that's our magic 100 dB radio that we kind of like to have. So this is how it looks. You feed in the two signals. I don't care what the spacing is. I don't have to go looking for the intermod products. Third order is always higher than fifth. And so if the two test signals are 2 kilohertz apart, the intermod product is 2 kcs above the higher frequency signal, 2 kcs below the lower frequency. And to be sure I'm really listening to the intermod product and not some spur, I wobble each generator, and the intermod product better wobble in frequency too. So you need to really know what's happening there. So that's, whether you're testing at 20 or 5 or whatever, that's how you go find the distortion product. A note on phase noise, or reciprocal mixing dynamic range, that there was some information in QST some years earlier, but it really wasn't emphasized. So since 2013, we've got the little color graphics on the product evaluations, and it'll have a little arrow thing. So if you're not real used to the definition, if you go to Bob Allison, he's the person, of course, that does all the product reviews from a laboratory standpoint. If you go to August 2012, it's in your book there, or May 2016, he's got a sidebar, and he explained what's really this is all about. But it just comes down to the fact that the local oscillator or the clock, everything has some level of noise, and it does affect performance in a really bad RF environment. Now, if you're middle of Kansas or Nebraska or something like that, maybe it doesn't bother you too much, but I don't know about the East Coast, or let alone in Germany or Europe or anywhere like that. So here's an example of what we're trying to explain here with what reciprocal mixing dynamic range is. And I found this graphic on the web. It's kind of cool. So that little bullet nose looking thing on the left, that's our weak signal that we're trying to copy. It's a multiplier. It's China. We need China. And there's a really strong signal very close in, and let's make it even a perfect signal. Of course, there is no such thing as a perfect signal with no noise, but even if it was, the local oscillator has noise. And so what happens is the noise on the local oscillator mixes with that really strong signal and puts noise sidebands on the signal. So even if it was perfect, which it isn't, it's going to be unperfect when the mixing occurs. So then you see over on the right, the noise gets transferred to that strong signal, and it overlaps the weak signal, and bye-bye weak signal. So that's what we're really talking about now with reciprocal mixing dynamic range, or the phase noise limitations of the radio. In the past, for like 20 years, ever since synthesized radios came out, they weren't very good then from that standpoint. It didn't drift, we liked that, and a digital readout, but that was the weak point. And there were only really a few radios of the down conversion type that really had low noise. And so most everything else was limited by the phase noise. Well, now that's all changed. It's just amazing what's happened in the last few years. If we look at all those radios, the new Kenwood, the new Yaesu, the Elecraft with the new synthesizer, if you've got a K3 that didn't come with it, it's like under $250. You really should consider that. So the Icoms, the Flexes, and all that, the Anons, we've really made giant strides in this respect. Now, we don't happen to own that magic 100 dB radio. So from about when the TR7 came out, that might have been, that's a Drake, that might have been the first up conversion radio. I'm not sure, but it came out in 1979. And then in 2003, the Ten-Tec Orion 1 came out, and they went back to low IF, 5 megahertz to about 11 megahertz. It varied 9 megahertz. And so before that, when we had all those up conversion radios, well, like a Pro 3 was an up conversion radio. Of course, the 7851's a different animal, but it's still an up conversion radio, but it's got an error roofing filter. But everybody else did not. Our dynamic range was really in the 70s, sometimes a little below 70, maybe 75, but pretty much in the 70s. And that's all we had. And on sideband, we got away with it. Why? Because adjacent channel splatter is pretty much the limit. On CW, though, different story, and we could have the radio kind of fold up in a pileup. But if we operate our radio properly with not run the preamp on 40 meters at night, things like that, use it when you need it, 10 meters, whatever, but we really don't want to push the radio to the stress level. Luckily, most of the time, our radios aren't stressed out to the maximum, or maybe we wouldn't have bought all those up-conversion radios for 20 years. So here's off my website, individual models, 18 radios that have a 90 dB or greater dynamic range. Now you notice that this new Yaesu that I just got to see a few days ago at the top at 110, but then clear down to the number 18 on this list, 90 dB, no problem. These are individual models. Now, if you said, well, I go to my website and I go down 18, I didn't get down to the Ten-Tec or Eagle, there's duplicates on there. It's not really totally, there's duplicate models, but I've got some cases where second sample to see if there's sample variation, and there is sample variation, more so in the direct sampling radios. So you just have to look at individual models and not like just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got a lot of choices and a lot of price range. Look, we can get a 7300 for $1,000. We can get a 7851 for much more than that, and everywhere in between. We've got a lot of radios now between $3,000 and $4,000. So not that that's inexpensive, but there's a lot of choices, and you can work a lot of DX with every one of these. And I ran the 7300 in a bunch of contests several years ago. So why did I say right at the beginning that we need a better radio for CW than we do on sideband? And that has to do with the bandwidth of the signals that are RQRM. A CW signal is only about a kc wide at 60 dB down if we don't have ridiculous key clicks. And a sideband signal is about 10 kcs wide at -60 if we're running everything properly. So we might overload a less performing radio in CW, but we probably won't on sideband because the guy that's 10 kcs wide at -60, that would mean if you're trying to copy a guy S3 and the guy 3 kcs away is 30/9, that's about 60 dB difference, and his signal is going to be in our passband. So here's what CW signal looks like on a spectrum analyzer, and the top one is a Ten-Tec set for a 3 millisecond rise time. That's the top one, the broad one. He's pretty wide in comparison to 3 milliseconds. That was a range that this Ten-Tec Omni 7 could do. Slowest was 10, the fastest was 3. And look, there's a 20 dB difference in the key clicks going between those rise time adjustments. It's right in a menu. Well, what's sad today, most everything today can go down to 1. And it probably tops out at 6. Now, I don't want to see anybody running their rig faster than 6. And I like on the 890 or the 101D, 6 is the slowest you can run it. I think the K3 has no adjustment at all. They're forcing you to have reasonable bandwidth and not have clicky signals. So that 1 millisecond is just nuts. So to compare sideband, where I'm saying, well, really, it's likely the splatter, the guy that's 2.5 kcs away. This is band-limited white noise being fed into the mic jack, 5 kc roll-off, and it's going to approximate speech if you just say, well, I'm going to average it. I'm calling CQ, 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 if I average it out, but I'm just going to feed in white noise to make it simpler for me. Well, look, we've got to get 6 kilohertz away from the side, the edge of the, in this case, it was a K3, typical Class A, B, or B rig, to get 60 dB down. But then the Mark V was a Class A rig, and you only had to be 1.5 kilohertz away. Well, wouldn't it be nice if everybody was 60 dB down, 1.5 kilohertz away instead of 6? Now, the new Yaesu doesn't have Class A as far as I know. I've only had it for a few days. But we have Apache now with what's called pure signal. Now, how many people here have heard about pure signal and the Apache? Okay. It's pre-distortion, and what you do is either it's just the rig by itself, or if you're running an amplifier, you pick off the signal and reduce the level about 50 or 60 dB, and it goes through a software algorithm that inverts the signal so that the distortion products are canceled out. And actually you can, if it's really adjusted right, do better than Class A, but heck, if you can do Class A, you're phenomenal. So that's what's potentially in the future. I know Flex has talked about it for like 10 years and they haven't done it yet. And how do we do it with a dedicated radio? I don't know. It takes a lot of number crunching, and that's where the computer operated radio has an advantage if somebody can really write the good software. If you say, well, I never saw white noise before, but you've seen two-tone tests, and so you see they're identical. You had to adjust the spacing right, but they show the same pattern. The distortion products of the white noise or the two-tone test are exactly the same. So how do we optimize whatever we have? N2IC, big contester. How many know Steve Lennon, N2IC? Okay. Well, he wins contests with a pair of TS590s, and you can buy them today for not too much on the used market, $700. So we can really make a whole lot of radios perform very well for us. What's important? Well, location, antennas, operator skill. We can all improve our operator skill. And the radio is important, but like Steve, he's got the antennas nailed. He's in a good location, and of course, he's an unbelievable operator. So what's the limit today? The improvement in the last 10 years is just kind of amazing. What hasn't improved are the transmitters. And if you can adjust your rise time to 1 millisecond and you're going to be really wide, that's terrible. Transmitters also transmit noise, just like we talked about reciprocal mixing dynamic range being a problem. Well, transmitted noise can be a problem. And more likely locally. I know there's a station in Boulder that lives 5 miles away from downtown, and he oversees the whole valley, and he's running FTDX 3000 before he had an MP, and he didn't bother anybody in Boulder with the MP, but with the 3000, he can wipe out 100 kcs of the band. So noise is an issue, and we need to be aware of that. So splatter, key clicks, transmitted noise can be our limit. I know when I was working the January contest, there was one station there that I looked up on his web page anyway, or QRZ, whatever it was, that's probably what he was running, and he was approaching 2 kcs wide on CW, and he really should be less than that if you've got the rise time set right, or the rig is clean. So transmitted noise, well, I'll just call anything that's not in the pass band of what we want. I mean, IMD splatters noise, key clicks are noise, reciprocal composite noise is all noise, and it just makes the problem. So again, 6 milliseconds. If you've got an adjustment, try that. Here's some information on the broadband noise coming out of rigs, and you look there, the K3S is at the top, and it hardly falls off, but the numbers are great. Some of the rigs aren't quite as good close in, but they fall off, and that's better. And some don't at all. The two there with the little red asterisks, almost no difference. So if you're field day, you better decide what rigs are going to allow to come into the place. If you got 2 signals on one band, if you're running CW and sideband, and now, of course, FT8 is going to be run, so we'll probably have 3 on 40 meters, probably 3 on 20 meters. So the transmitted noises can be a big deal because we know we can't have to work in a 1,000-foot radius. Or is it diameter? 1 or 2. It gets worse with the lower power. A lot of us have solid-state rigs, solid-state amplifiers that only need 30, 40, 50 watts of drive. If you got an 8877 or several of the tube amps, you can drive them with 30 or 40 watts. That's why if you look in QSD at a product review, you'll see transmit noise at 100 watts or whatever the maximum is, and at 30 watts, because if we're driving our amp that doesn't need much drive, in this case, almost every rig has had more noise when we've backed off the power. One thing that I'd like to see improved at the league, they've got a nice Roden Schwartz analyzer that measures phase noise. And most of the time that's fine, but not always. We really want to know composite noise. Composite noise, what is that? That's total noise, whether it's phase noise or AM noise. So that's what's really critical. And the league is looking at getting an option for their Roden Schwartz, but it doesn't do it all automatically. They have to do one and the other. And so I don't know how they're going to solve the problem, but we've been talking about it for a couple of months. I'm going to show you an example of the 7300 with the current Roden Schwartz phase noise meter. And if any of you would like to buy one for me, there's one on eBay. It's only $145,000. But I can measure this much with a $2,000 worth of test equipment. So I can make these measurements with a Perseus receiver and a really clean signal generator if it's outside the Perseus range, which only goes up to 40 megahertz. So if I want to measure 6 meters, 2 meters, 70 centimeters, I got to mix it down. But I can make these measurements for like $2,000, not $145,000. But if you can see the graph there, the bottom one is the phase noise, and it goes, tailing off and goes way down. But then the one above that that's dominant, that's the AM noise is dominating. So, well, that's the composite noise graph. So if you're out there like at 10 kilohertz, the composite noise is 20 dB worse than the phase noise. So we really need to know what's the composite noise and not phase noise only, because on some radios, it's not going to be almost the same like others, where maybe the difference is 3 dB in some other radio, but in this case, it wasn't. Well, solid-state amps. Linear amps, not so linear. In 1997, the league published a compendium of half a dozen tube amplifiers, and every one of them was either 40 or 50 dB down on third-order distortion products using the PEP method. Down 40 or 50, and that's pretty good. The most recent review in QST of a popular solid-state amp, only down 30 compared to 40 or 50. Now, no mention was made of the fact that by comparison, but there it is. And an amp that hasn't been reviewed yet, I tested this, or Ken N0QO did, and it was even worse a little bit worse on 10 and 6. So we've kind of got a trade-off. You don't have to tune the solid-state amps. They probably need an antenna tuner if you've got much of an SWR, and they're smaller and they don't have 3,000 volts and all that, but we haven't made progress there unless you're using pure signal and Apache, well, in which case you have a sampler. Every amp that's come out now in the last few years has a sampler output, and the only radio it works with is an Apache. So you can clean all that up, but right now we're stuck with one brand to do that. So what's the bottom line? Let's really watch how we're running our radio and gain. Preamps at night on the low bands, forget it. Attenuation is appropriate. Again, if the S meter is reading upscale on band noise, tuned between the signal, of course, then we really have no reason not to put in some attenuation, however you want to do it. Attenuator, RF gain. I really like the 7610. I can adjust the attenuation in 3 dB steps. That's really cool. But you can, if you have 6 dB steps, you can do that, or turn the RF gain down a little bit. The super hets that, like the K3S, the new Kenwood, the new Yaesu, we can be sloppy because of the roofing filter, but we can't really be sloppy with the direct sampling if we're in a situation where we've got a lot of big signals. Now, at WRTC, we had every brand and all sorts of different radios being used, and I didn't hear anybody say when I was on 40 meters, my radio folded up. So they must really, get it, like, okay, I'm going to operate it the right way. Most of the radios, except the Flex that are direct sampling, have an overload indicator. It's called OVF, and the Icom, the Apache flashes, and so you should be cognizant of when this happens. I've only seen an Icom that I was running in a 10-meter contest a couple years ago. It happened to be a 7300, and I had preamp 2 on, so I was really maximum gain. Signals are really weak. And then for a brief moment of about 20 seconds, the overload light was flashing, and I didn't hear anything, but it was flashing. Well, I'm about 700 feet from Highway 14, and there's a lot of truckers driving down Highway 14. And I'm sure they're all running 5 watts on Citizens, man. Or maybe they're running a 3CX 3000, I don't know. So that's my guess. What happened was the trucker was driving by, and my antenna was pointed southeast, because guess what? I was working South America. What else were you working on 10 meters at that point? And so he was flickering away. And if I'd probably switched off preamp 2 and gone to preamp 1, but he was gone in 20 seconds. It didn't matter. But that's, so watch those overload indicators. So I've reiterated 40 meters and below, watch your gain. It's kind of a numbers game. Now, what I'd want to be clear, people go to my website, and I'm really happy they do that. And some people will say, I've got 100 dB radio, and now there's 105. I should dump my 100 dB radio and buy a 105 dB radio. Like, really? So look at the big picture. Once we've got 18 radios there on that list, and there's more, that you can work all sorts of DX and just run the radio the optimal way. But it's nice to see numbers going up over time, of course. But don't be a fanatic to one number, because there's so much important beyond that. So you say, okay, I'm weed out the duds, and then I want to look at things like factory support, clean audio, clean receive audio, clean transmit audio, good noise reduction, all these other things. Do they break? I mean, if a radio breaks all the time, I got no use for it. So this is like a starting point that say, okay, one time I was at an OEM, and he said, well, you could draw a line at some point and say, consider everything above the line and consider everything below it, forget it. That's fine. Just don't say, I got to have in this case, what's the newest radio on the block that's got 110? I haven't used it on the air yet, because we only had the thing for 2 days. So, and that's really great, but then I don't just say I got to own the 110 dB radio. One thing on your book, you can see a lot of videos from the past from Contest University. The website will have this updated version. Like I said, I spent all day last weekend updating this, so your book doesn't have some of the slides you saw. But there's at the bottom. Some of the contests that I've run, I would write up sort of a stream of consciousness as how do these radios compare. There's maybe about 4 or 5 of them. And so Rick, DJ0's IP, has got a website there, and he puts a lot of things that I do. And so you can go in there and kind of look at what he calls shootouts. So if you're interested in seeing shootouts, there's a URL you can take a look at.